Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 11 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 unforgettable explorations into the realm of the supernatural. And we are going to go over the copyright information, which should be on the screen right now. Okay, let me find it real quick. I need to go, here it is. It says, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. It's copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. All rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company Incorporated, a Random House company. And the addresses are there. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, printed and bound in the United States of America. Library of Congress information is there as well if you are interested in that. Now, in the last book, we had an interesting encounter with Lancer, who seems to be the captain of the U-boat that is chasing the Queen of Glasgow. So this is kind of interesting, and would kind of explain why Lancer on the Queen of Glasgow knew what was happening. So, anyways, we're going to go back a little ways. A warning shell? Why? And wait. And wait for what? There are passengers on that ship with women among them. Passengers have no rights on board, women least of all. But they are human beings like ourselves, so are the crew. And therefore we must take their therefore they must take their chances as we do. Not when there is no necessity for it, pleaded Mueller. We could still give them time to take to their boats, while their radio man sends out their position and gives ours with it as well. Sentiment has begun to soften your brain, Mueller. Lancer Glare had turned his colorless eyes as cold and hard as ice. He glanced at his wristwatch, saw the last few seconds sweep away. At precisely 1:15, Lancer pointed his finger, and the searchlight's beam cut a swath through the night, focusing squarely on the drifting Queen of Glasgow. At Lancer's order, fire! The deck gun boomed, and the first shell was on its way to a direct hit. From then on, the freighter received an efficient, perfectly timed bombardment that rapidly sent her down by the bow. Little figures ran helter-skelter about the doomed ship's deck, disappearing amid the collapsing superstructure, except for one man who paused briefly near the sinking bow, shook his fist into the searchlight's glare, and then ran for shelter. As the freighter finally slid down into the sea, Lancer ordered the searchlight to sweep the surface, and he called for the gun crew to be ready. They were launching a lifeboat on the starboard side, Lancer told Mueller. If we sight it, we can spare a shell to sink it. You mean that you intend to add more murder? I mean that I intend to complete our mission. Lancer followed the roving searchlight through his binoculars, but the fog banks were rolling in again, even covering the spot where the city of Glasgow had gone down. Lancer spoke to Mueller. Come below. We must submerge and continue on our way. In the wardroom of the U-boat, Lancer jotted down the details of the kill and listened happily to the steady rhythm of the submerged sub's motors. He sighed, he signed his report, and turned to Mueller with a harsh laugh. Too bad I have no more space on my report, Lieutenant, Lancer said. I could have added that you are an old woman, because I didn't think it right to murder people without warning. That, Lieutenant, is a question for international law. Perhaps it is governed by a higher law, Captain. There could be a special kind of hell waiting for us. Maybe we will have to suffer the same agony that those trapped and drowning victims did before they finally died. I agree, that can happen to any of us at once. I don't mean just once, I mean over and over throughout eternity. You talk like a foolish mystic, Lieutenant. We might go on trying to warn them forever, yet never be able to save them. Lancer laughed. I will take my chances. Get some Go get some sleep, Mueller. I think you need it. Lancer rose, gave Mueller a whack between the shoulders. At, at that moment, the whole wardroom quivered, and a muffled blast, reminiscent of the shell fire, came to their ears. Angrily, Lancer snarled, "A depth bomb? Destroyers from the convoy. The radio man must have given our position to spite us. You see now, Mueller, why our business is murder, as you call it, and not mercy? Where is that higher law now?" There were more jarring bursts. The depth bombs were hitting closer. Lancer submerged the U-boat deeper until using every trick he knew to escape the impending doom, but to no avail. One violent explosion made the sub's plates quiver, extinguishing her lights and disabling her motors. Another blast still closer, and the hull of the U-boat gave way in upon Lancer. Poured the same green deluge that had inundated the cabin on the Queen of Glasgow. Lancer was choking, drowning as he had before, dying that same hopeless, overwhelming death. And then green water thinned to a soupy fog. Instead of total saturation, Lancer felt only dampness on the ship's rail, from which he raised his hand and ran his long fingers through his blonde hair. He was trying to orient himself to this timeless, oft-repeated scene as he spoke the name that was only half familiar, but best suited for these new surroundings, Curtis Lancer, the name of a passenger on the Queen of Glasgow. For that was the name Lancer saw on a lifeboat that was hanging from its davits. A door opened and a steward appeared. He spoke to Lancer. "They will be finishing serving dinner soon." Yes, Lancer had gone through this so often more before, but he was still groping, wondering how he fitted into it. Somehow it seemed endless, part of a mental treadmill, so hideously unreal, that it might be the only reality that he had ever known, or ever would know, perhaps forever and forever. Yet time was moving on, time in terms of mortal reckoning. Minutes, hours, years, some 20 or of those years had passed, and a giant liner was cleaving its way through fog-bound waters, throating a deep warning whistle, and to other shipping in the area. It was the same portion of the Atlantic Ocean where the freighter called the Queen of Glasgow had wandered from its convoy during wartime to be trailed to its doom by a lurking U-boat. No need for convoys now. How different the swift glide of this mighty ship, blaring its path through the misty shroud, compared to the throbbing, hopeless flight of the wayward freighter. That was so apparent to the woman who stood by the rail. Who stood by the rail near the liner's bow, looking off into the swirling fog. Time had been kind to Barbara Stanley. The strained, taut expression on her face was not the mark of age. It was due to her recollection of a fearful night in these same waters, when from the safety of a lifeboat she had watched a sinking freighter carry her dead and dying friends to the ocean's depths. Tonight, almost against her will, she had come from her cabin to the deck of the liner, lured by her remembrance of that other fog-locked night. Now, as Barbara gazed, the misty curtain parted. Off in the swirl, she saw the dreaded sight that had etched itself into her memory. There, as real as on the fatal night, was the battered hull of the Queen of Glasgow, her bow nosing beneath the ocean surface for the last long dive. And on the platform freighter deck, her hands waving a frantic gesture for the lifeboats. His hands waving a frantic gesture for the lifeboat to get away was the man whose name Barbara now whispered, Curtis Lancer. Liner's lookout did not see the ghost ship from the past, even though it belonged to the present and to the future. Barbara's glimpse through the misty curtain of time was promptly verified. As she turned from the liner's rail, she saw a muffled man standing there beside her, his eyes fixed on the closing fog. In a hushed tone, Barbara asked, "You saw the ship out there?" "Yes," came the solemn reply. "She was the Queen of Glasgow." "And you saw the man who waved that warning from the rail?" "Yes, Kurt Lancer, the commander of the U-boat that shelled her." In all those intervening years, Barbara Stanley had half believed that there must be such an answer. Incredible though it may seem, it was the only way to account for Lancer's presence on the freighter, and all the facts that he had known. Now, as Barbara studied the broad face of the solemn man beside her, she was suddenly inspired to ask, "But how do you know all this about Kurt Lancer?" "Because I was his second in command. My name is Hans Mueller, and as we watched from the conning tower, I somehow knew that what Lancer's fate would be. Within an hour, our U-boat was sunk by depth bombs from a British destroyer. Kurt Lancer believed that he would perish like his victims. Only once, but time and again, I have stood at the rail of a ship like this and watched him go down with the Queen of Glasgow." "The ghost of an unhappy man," Barbara spoke in a sad whisper, "trapped forever on the ghost of an unfortunate ship." She was staring hard into the thickening fog, picturing the strange sight that had been unveiled there. Yes, Kurt Lancer was alone that night, as he was tonight. The fog had closed in again, but Barbara was still gazing into its impenetrable folds, as she spoke again to the man beside her. "But tell me, Mr. Mueller, if your submarine was depth bombed, how could there have been any survivors? How do you happen to be here?" There was no reply. Barbara turned and stared with wide, amazed eyes. No one was standing there beside her. She was alone under the fog-blurred lights that showed the broad, open stretch of the liner's sweeping deck. As in a dream, Barbara Stanley went back to her cabin. Okay, and that does it for Judgment Night. Now we are going to start The Curse of Seven Towers. Against the late afternoon sky, the frowning battlements and tall turrets of Seven Towers presented a strange, fanciful picture of a giant's castle, wrestled from its storybook setting and transplanted to modern times. High above the ancient stronghold, jet planes were leaving long, snake-like trails behind them, catching the gold and crimson rays of the sunset like streaks from a master painter's brush. Through the deer park in the darkening foreground, past the shadowy outlines of boxed hedges and stately yew trees, the light of approaching cars were following the curving driveways leading to the massive Greystone pile. Surrounding these mighty bastions was a water-filled moat, which gave the impression that the castle was floating on the surface of a dark, sylvan pool. At the very center of the huge sprawling structure was a mammoth gateway. From it extended a drawbridge, like a giant's tongue, thrust from a yawning mouth. Above the great iron grating of a raised portcullis, resembling tremendous teeth, ready to champ down upon unwelcome visitors who tried to enter the inner court beyond. But this evening, all visitors were welcome. In contrast to forgotten men-at-arms who had once ridden their war horses through the fortified castles, the pedestrians the present arrivals drove their cars, convertibles, compacts, station wagons into the gaping maw of the great stone castle. There they parked in the very spaces where steeds carried bound and helpless prisoners. where steeds carrying bound and helpless prisoners had formerly been tethered. Like those medieval captives, some of the newcomers were a bit bewildered as they unlimbered themselves from their cars. To find themselves suddenly planted half a dozen centuries back was something of a shock to those who first experienced it, but to others, those who had visited Seven Towers before, this was the beginning of the fun. They too had been dumbfounded on their first trip here. Now they relished seeing others in a like plight. Paul Corley, regarded as a prankster by his London cronies, was one of the regular visitors who liked to prod newcomers with pointed quips. His roundish moon face, totally solemn, Corley approached a rugged, square-jawed Australian named Gordon Woodrow and announced seriously, what did he announce? Let's see. "You were lucky, Woodrow, that you didn't hit a deer coming through the park. In the old days, they cut your ears off and branded you twice over for a trifling offense like that." Helene Lowland, a striking, vivacious blonde, overheard Corley's remark, and as she was alighting from her chauffeured limousine. "Don't believe anything Paul tells you, Mr. Woodrow," said Helene. We are all very lucky to be invited to Seven Towers for these old-time revels." "And you are the luckiest of all," Helene retorted Corley. "If the old original Sieur Dubois hadn't built his gateway wide enough for his horsemen to ride two abreast, that hired back of yours would have lost all four fenders coming through the gate." Gordon Woodrow, his lips firmed in restrained impatience, waited until Corley had finished. Then Woodrow put in a quick query. "You say revels, Miss Lowland. I thought we were invited here to engage in a ghost hunt, or am I misinformed?" Both Helene and Corley gave quick, hushed gestures. "Never use that term," Corley said in an undertone. "You don't hunt ghosts in Seven Towers. They hunt you. In fact, don't mention ghosts until the subject is duly introduced. Someone might hear you up there." From Corley's sepulchral tone, Woodrow thought he meant the towering heights above that and some spectral being that might dwell therein, particularly as Corley made an upward gesture as he spoke. Then, as Woodrow scanned the central tower, his gaze came downward and saw what Corley meant. On an iron-railed balcony just above the courtyard, a slender man with a gaunt, pale face was studying the arrivals. There, the earlier lords of the castle had taken their stance in olden days to appraise the booty that their raiding henchmen had brought home. This was the modern version of that time of feudal barons. The Honorable James Boyce, present minister of Seven Towers, and the direct descendant of the original Sieur Dubois. Instead of wearing an expression of malevolent contempt, as suited his ancestral bearing, Boyce was greeting everyone with a truly disarming smile that marked him as the hunted type, rather than a hunter. The lips that showed disdain were Gordon Woodrow's, and as the burly Australian contrasted the massive bulk of Seven Towers with the insignificant build of its owner. "He reminds me of a dried walnut kernel," commented Woodrow, rattling about in an oversized shell. "That's our Jimmy boy," Corley chuckled. "I couldn't have pegged him better myself." The last of the 24 guests arrived. Now a few of the cars were leaving, among them Helene's hired limousine, which was going back to London. Servants clad in faded ancient livery carried the luggage past a guardroom, where a watchman pressed the switch of an electric motor that lowered the portcullis by modern cable, cutting off the outside world. "Our cars are parked safely for the night," said Corley, in his same sepulchral tone. "Just as we will be later. Let's hope." James Boyce had come down from the outside balcony to welcome his guests as they entered the great hall. After that formality, they were conducted to their assigned apartments with servants as guides. They passed several chambers. They passed through chambers hung with heavy ancient tapestries, along a hallway flanked by suits of burnished armor, up grand staircases and spiral staircases to corridors that turned and angled through the labyrinthic floors above. Through it, though it was still daylight, the slanted rays of the setting sun were dimmed by tarot windows and stained glass panes, bringing early gloom to the interior of the castle. Despite her familiarity with these scenes, Helene was gripped anew by their weird spell. This was due partly to the effect of the surroundings on Helene's companion, Cynthia Gifford, a dark-eyed brunette who had come along on the trip from London. Cynthia, who was playing lead roles in television productions of early English dramas, had been very eager to visit Seven Towers, but so far the effect upon her had been more than overwhelming. It was chilling. I actually froze when I passed those suits of armor," Cynthia confided. They seemed so icy. I was sure that monsters were crouching inside them." "Except," corrected Helene, "you can't crouch inside a suit of armor." "Perhaps I can't," returned Cynthia, "but that doesn't mean a monster couldn't." Cynthia broke off with a sharp gasp and pointed wildly at the servant who accompanied them. He went into a crouch of his own, but he was only stooping to unlock a door. Promptly he opened it and bowed Helene into a high-ceilinged room with massive furniture dominated by a large four-poster bed, all vaguely visible by the fading light from a deep-set window in the wall beyond. "This is my regular room," announced Helene, "and I like it. I come here for a rest cure. In case you didn't know, it is quieting, comforting, and far away from the city. I sleep better here than anywhere else." The liveried servant was turning on electric lamps, and although they were too few to illuminate the room brightly, they gave it a cozy effect. "That's why I brought you here, Cynthia," continued Helene in her volatile but emphatic way. "I felt it would soothe your jangled nerves. Your room is around the corner in the next corridor. You will like it." Helene waved to the servant who conducted Cynthia out into the corridor and around the corner. Helene called a last reminder. "Leave the light on in your room, Cynthia. I always do, so I can find my way back. The corridors become really, really dark later." Soon Cynthia found herself in a room that was very similar to Helene's, but a little smaller, which meant that it was better lighted. This pleased Cynthia all the more. She changed to a dinner gown, left the room, and closed the door behind her. She reached the corner of the corridor, then guided herself by the dim light from Helene's door, which was open. Helene was also dressing for dinner, and they went downstairs together. All the other guests were gathered there, and they were ushered into the great banquet hall, which occupied the entire ground floor space beneath the Tudor Towers. The Tudor Tower. Some 50 feet square, the banquet hall was more than 2 stories in height, allowing for a balcony where minstrels and musicians put on a continuous show, paced by a gesture in medieval cap and bells. The dinner itself was lavish, but quite modern, except for a few special delicacies and rare wines that were served in the Dubois tradition. The party sat at a T-shaped table with James Boyce at the head, facing the musician's balcony. On Boyce's right was an elderly but keen-faced man, whose manner was remarkably alert. He was Cyril Morrowcroft, former Cambridge professor and a noted historian, whose works had gained acclaim in literary circles. Seated on Boyce's left was Gordon Woodrow, who also rated as a special guest of honor. Apparently, the Australian had formed a better opinion of his host, for the two conversed quite amiably, a fact that Corley noted and mentioned in due undertone to Helene, who was next to him at the long table. There was something else, however, that impressed them more. Seen side by side, there was a certain resemblance between Boyce and Woodrow, but like their general physique, it was largely in the Australian's favor. We are going to have to stop this here. Find my bookmark. We've been reading from The Curse of Seven Towers. It is from the book Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, and it is adapted by Walter B. Gibson. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.